She only wanted a fresh start, a quiet job, a quieter life, and a way to breathe again after losing her daughter. He had everything: wealth, power, and a name that built skylines, but not the one thing he truly wanted back. And then, by accident, she walked into the wrong room, and everything began to unravel. Why did a total stranger's family photo leave a powerful CEO speechless? Why did a man who hadn't smiled in 7 years suddenly cancel his most important meeting? And what secret, buried in the blueprints of a failed design, could change everything they thought they knew about loss and each other? This isn't a love story. This is a story about grief, redemption, and how two broken people accidentally became each other's beginning, set in the quiet hills of Vermont. This accidental moment between Millionaire CEO and secretary changed their lives. Forever is more than a title. It's a question: what if the people we've lost are the ones who lead us to those we're meant to find? If this opening stirred something in your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let us take you into a story where one moment, just one, changed everything. It was her first morning at Hale and Whitmore. The snow from last night still clung to the edges of the slate sidewalk, melting slowly under the reluctant sun. Emily Rhodes paused just outside the heavy oak doors of the firm's main building, gathering herself, adjusting her scarf, smoothing down the collar of her navy coat. There was nothing particularly special about today to anyone else, but to her, it felt like the first inhale after holding her breath for too long. Inside, the lobby was grand but quiet, lined with steel beams and reclaimed wood, a modern blend, respectful of the Vermont heritage around it. She smiled politely at the receptionist, signed in, and was quickly handed a slim badge with her name, Emily Rhodes, Executive Assistant. They didn't call it secretary anymore, not in places like this. She had read about Hale and Whitmore in college, even before life had taken its turns and detours. Now, by some odd turn of fate, she was here, starting again. The HR assistant who welcomed her was kind but brisk, handing her a printed schedule and a floor plan that looked more like a maze than a building. Emily nodded, pretending to understand, but her nerves were already tugging at her focus. She was shown her temporary workspace just down the hall from the executive wing and told to be at the orientation meeting in Conference 4C in 15 minutes. After settling her bag and coat, she took one last sip of her coffee and quietly asked where the nearest restroom was. The assistant waved vaguely to the left. End of the hall. You'll see it. Emily headed in that direction, the hallway stretching farther than expected. She counted 2 left turns, then a small stairwell, and then another hallway. No signs, only the soft hum of overhead lights and her heels clicking quietly on the polished concrete floor. A wooden door came into view, no plaque, no label. She hesitated for a second, then pushed it open. And that's when everything tilted. It wasn't a restroom, it was a boardroom. And not just any boardroom, this one held the entire executive team, seated around a long walnut table. At the far end stood a tall man in a tailored charcoal suit, gesturing toward a digital rendering on the screen behind him. He turned just as the door creaked open, and their eyes met. Emily froze. The man who could only be Jonathan Hale himself. The founding partner and CEO stopped mid-sentence. His hand, still raised, lowered slowly. A long beat passed. Then Emily did the only thing she could. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, clutching her tote bag close and backing toward the door. "I was looking for the restroom." She turned quickly, but in her haste, her elbow caught the strap of her bag. It slid off her shoulder and tumbled to the floor with a soft thud. Papers spilled. A pen rolled toward the far side of the room. And among the mess was a small photograph, a worn image of a little girl with sandy curls and bright eyes, smiling in a school uniform, and a folded letter, handwritten, edges softened with time. No one moved, no one spoke. Jonathan stepped forward, not with anger or impatience, but slowly, quietly. He crouched just enough to pick up the photo between 2 fingers. He stared at it longer than a stranger should. Then he looked up at Emily, his expression unreadable. But his eyes carried something else. Recognition, ache. He handed the photo to her without a word. "Thank you," she murmured, too embarrassed to meet his gaze. Her cheeks burned. She gathered her things, stood, and nodded a quick apology before pulling the door shut behind her. She could feel the weight of every stare long after the door clicked closed. Back in the hallway, her hands trembled as she returned the items to her bag. Her breath came shallow, heart pounding. She hadn't meant to cry, but the moment she looked at the photo again, she nearly did. It was Lily's favorite picture. She used to tuck it into her lesson planner back when she was still teaching. Even now, years later, she kept it close. Some things never faded, no matter how much time passed. She took a long, slow breath and made her way back to the correct conference room, which, to her dismay, was directly below the one she had just interrupted. She slid into a seat near the back, hoping no one had heard anything yet. Upstairs, in the boardroom, now quiet again, Jonathan stood with his back to the table. The meeting had resumed for only 2 more minutes before he stopped speaking altogether. "I'll circulate the rest of the notes," he said flatly. "That's all for today." The room shifted uncomfortably. It was rare for Jonathan Hale to end anything early. Rarer still for him to seem distracted. He left before anyone could ask questions, the door closing behind him with a hush. In his office, the winter light filtered in, pale and slow through the large windows. Jonathan stood at his desk, motionless. He opened the top drawer and pulled out an old, creased photo. His own daughter, Anna, at age 9. Her smile was slightly crooked, one tooth missing. Her curls, light and soft. Her eyes, the same warmth as in the photo the young woman had dropped. She had been gone since 2016, a hiking accident in Colorado with her mother. A moment no blueprint could plan around. Jonathan hadn't let anyone get close since. But now, a stranger's photo had shaken him in a way he didn't quite understand. The girl wasn't Anna. Of course not. But for a moment, it had felt like she was... He sat down, staring at the 2 photos side by side, his daughter and the girl from the woman's bag. 2 smiles, 2 stories, one ache that never really left. Downstairs, Emily tried to focus on the presentation, on the introductions, the company's mission and values, but her mind kept drifting back to the eyes of the man in the boardroom. Not cold, not unkind, just wounded. Was it possible, she wondered, that someone else carried a grief as heavy as her own? And if so, what did it mean that they had collided in such a way? The sound of the office door clicking shut echoed softly in the large room, swallowed quickly by the layers of silence that Jonathan Hale had grown so used to. His office on the 4th floor overlooked Lake Champlain, a sweeping view of frozen water stretching toward the pale mountains on the horizon. In spring, it would shimmer, but in late winter, it held a stillness that suited him: quiet, vast, untouchable. The photo still sat on his desk, not Emily's, of course. Hers had long been returned to her trembling hands. But his photo, Anna, age 9, with her jacket half-zipped and her front teeth missing, smiling beside a snowman they had built the day before the trip. That had been 7 winters ago. He remembered the feel of her mitten in his palm, the way she always insisted her snowman needed personality, not just buttons and coal. He remembered the voice message from his wife the next morning, the last time he would ever hear either of them speak. The avalanche had come without warning. Everyone called it a tragedy. The papers blamed it on climate change, shifting snowpacks, a flaw in the terrain. But Jonathan had known better. The design was his. The camp they'd been scouting, the architectural layout, the timing, it had all been his. And though no one said it aloud, he carried the guilt like frost on bone. At Hale and Whitmore, Jonathan had earned a reputation for precision, for brilliance, for distance. He kept his meetings short, his conversations clinical. The few who lasted more than 2 years at the firm learned not to take his silence personally. It was just his way. He didn't make small talk, he didn't attend office parties, Annie didn't hire women for close administrative roles, not since Anna and Elise died. Not because he distrusted women, he just couldn't handle the resemblance. So, when the new hire arrived, he barely registered her name. The decision had been made by HR, reviewed by his second-in-command. She was a former educator, apparently, with strong references and a quiet presence. That's all he'd gathered. Until yesterday morning, when she opened the wrong door and everything fractured for a moment. The girl in her photograph, the way her eyes curved, the shape of her jaw. It didn't make sense, but Jonathan couldn't shake the resemblance. It hit him in a place he thought had long since gone numb. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, closed the folder in front of him, and stood. Meanwhile, Emily sat in a small shared office space near the end of the executive corridor. Her desk was neat, her laptop already set up. She'd arrived early, trying to prove her readiness. She liked quiet spaces always had, and this one was tucked far enough from foot traffic to suit her. She hadn't told anyone about what had happened upstairs. No one asked, and she didn't offer. But it had stayed with her the way Jonathan Hale had looked at her photograph, not with annoyance, but with something softer, as if he saw something in it that she didn't. Emily hadn't planned to come back east. Oregon had been her home for years. Her daughter, Lily, had been born there. She'd taught Spanish and English at a local high school for nearly a decade. Then the accident happened, a drunk driver, a rainy night, and a phone call at 1:12 a.m. That carved her heart in two. She hadn't driven on that stretch of highway since when she finally left the school. No one blamed her. Take time, they said. Go anywhere you need to. So she did. She packed her things into her father's old truck and headed east, stopping only when the road curved near Burlington, and the mountains felt like a shield. The job at Hale and Whitmore had come by chance. She hadn't even expected a response. Now, here she was. First week, first test. The first email came just after 9 a.m. Subject line, revision request. Urgent. Attached were documents from the executive team layouts for a high-profile resort Jonathan had personally designed. The files were mismatched, half were labeled incorrectly. The client expected revisions before end of day. Emily blinked at the screen. The assistant who'd trained her had warned Mr. Hale doesn't tolerate sloppiness. If something's broken, fix it before he sees it. So she did. For the next 4 hours, Emily barely moved. She corrected file names, rechecked floor plans, added missing notes, and quietly delivered the revised folder to the executive inbox. No one thanked her, no one noticed, except Jonathan. Later that afternoon, she received a short message. Confirmed, revisions accurate. JH. Just 3 lines, but something about the brevity felt deliberate, not curt, not cold, just precise. The next day, another test came, a meeting that was moved up by an hour. The room hadn't been set. The welcome packets hadn't been printed. The client, a German investor, arrived early. Emily didn't panic. She printed the packets, found fresh coffee, and helped the translator adjust the agenda. By the time Jonathan entered the room, everything looked seamless. He didn't smile, but he gave her a nod, a barely there tilt of the head, and that was more than she expected. What Emily didn't know was that Jonathan was watching, not in a suspicious way, just observing. There was a steadiness about her, a quiet gravity. She never looked hurried, even when things were clearly on fire. Her tone stayed calm. Her posture never begged for approval. One afternoon, as she quietly worked through a pile of the mismatched scheduling notes, Jonathan walked past her desk. He paused. She didn't notice him at first. She was focused, lightly tapping a pencil against the desk in a steady rhythm, a habit, maybe, or a way to pace her thoughts. He spoke without thinking. You're unusually calm for someone cleaning up someone else's chaos. Emily looked up, surprised. She smiled gently. I've lived through worse. Jonathan hesitated, then asked, Where'd you learn that kind of composure? She held his gaze for a moment, then said quietly, from loss. Nothing more, no elaboration, no apology. Jonathan didn't respond, but the words settled somewhere deep. He walked away, more slowly than before. That evening, after the staff had left, Jonathan stayed behind. The building was quiet. He opened the cabinet behind his desk and pulled down a leather-bound photo album, one he hadn't touched in years. Inside were memories his wife, Elise, holding a steaming mug on their porch, Anna in her snow boots, cheeks pink from cold, the three of them on a bridge in Paris, the city lights behind them. He turned the page and stopped. There was a photo of Anna at age 6, sitting on a swing in the backyard, her curls bouncing, that crooked smile. It was almost the same expression as the little girl in the photo Emily had dropped. The likeness shook him. He wasn't a man prone to superstition, but something about it wouldn't leave him alone. Was it coincidence or something else? Back at her apartment, Emily sat by the window with a cup of chamomile tea, the photo of Lily tucked in the frame nearby. She'd been good today, calm, professional, but inside, she felt the ache curling quietly beneath the surface, the ache that never left. Still, there was something about that man, Jonathan Hale, not his reputation, not his title, but his eyes. They didn't scare her. They didn't intimidate her. If anything, they looked familiar. By the end of her second week at Hale and Whitmore, Emily Rhodes had completed 7 executive-level assignments, restructured 2 filing systems, corrected mislabeled architectural submissions, and flawlessly navigated 3 last-minute meeting changes without dropping a single ball. It wasn't just efficiency, it was precision. Quiet, steady precision that most people didn't expect from someone who called herself just the assistant. What they didn't know, and what she never explained, was that Emily wasn't afraid of pressure. She had lived through something far worse than a missed deadline. When you've buried your only child, everything else feels survivable. The first real test came on a Monday morning, wrapped in polite urgency. Jonathan Hale sent her a message marked time sensitive. An investor reception was being rescheduled due to weather, moved up by 4 days. The guest list included donors, architects from 2 continents, and a state representative who insisted on vegetarian hors d'oeuvres. The previous assistant would have panicked. Emily read the message twice, then stood, slipped on her coat, and walked down the block to the local florist. She didn't email back, she just started solving the problem. By the end of the day, the reception had a new caterer, a modified layout, and printed name tags in both English and Japanese, something no one had asked for. But Jonathan would later notice. She didn't seek praise, she simply added it to her list and moved on. A few days later, another request landed on her desk, this one more subtle, but just as weighty. Emily, the message began. Please review the attached floor plan notes and compare against the original versions in the library archive. Ensure consistency. No rush. It came from Daniel, one of the senior architects. The problem. The original files weren't digitized. They were stored in the lower-level archive room, cold, dim, and utterly disorganized. Some hadn't been touched in a decade. She brought gloves and a flashlight. For the next 3 days, Emily spent her lunch breaks and evenings sifting through rolled blueprints, noting discrepancies in structural annotations and timeline stamps. She didn't just file the corrected information, she flagged 3 subtle design flaws and HVAC placements that had likely gone unnoticed. Daniel didn't reply right away. When he did, his message was short. You've got an eye? We missed this. Thank you. Word traveled fast after that. The next challenge came cloaked in cultural complexity. Jonathan was meeting with Japanese consultants from a real estate firm considering expansion in Vermont. It was a tentative partnership, fragile, full of nuance. A local interpreter had canceled last minute. Emily, upon overhearing, quietly offered to help. I speak enough Japanese, she said simply. Not fluent, but enough to soften the edges. Jonathan hesitated. He didn't like improvisation, but the meeting was in 2 hours. Fine, he said. Join us. That afternoon, in the sleek glass conference room, Emily sat beside Jonathan, notepad in hand, ears sharp. The Japanese consultants were formal, polite, reserved. Jonathan, for all his brilliance, was blunt, concise, to the point of being abrupt. When he stated, "We expect turnaround within 30 days," Emily paused, then gently offered Mr. Hale would be honored by a timely collaboration, and we understand the complexity such timelines involve. She didn't change the message, just the tone, and that was everything. The consultants nodded, smiled. One of them chuckled softly. The rest of the meeting flowed like spring water. Later that evening, Jonathan stopped by her desk. Everyone else had gone home. Only the low hum of the exit sign filled the hallway. "You translated more than words today," he said. Emily looked up. "Did I? You adjusted my phrasing." She hesitated. "Was that inappropriate?" He folded his arms, considering. "Was I wrong?" Emily shook her head. "No, just the way we speak isn't always the way others hear. Language does more than deliver content. It builds bridges, or walls." Jonathan tilted his head. "So I built a wall." "You built a sentence," she replied. I softened the corners. Something flickered across his face. Not quite amusement, not disapproval either. Something curious. He walked away without another word, but from that moment forward, things shifted. Jonathan began to observe Emily more closely, not with suspicion, but interest. He noticed the way she tapped her index finger against her cup when deep in thought, the way she greeted Walter, the elderly security guard, by name each morning, the way she always brought an extra granola bar just in case someone forgets lunch. She wasn't loud, but her presence was unmistakable. One afternoon, during a heated planning session between the landscape architect and Jonathan himself, the team found themselves at an impasse over water drainage lines. Emily, sitting in the corner with her notes, quietly stood and pointed to a section on the map. "If you shift the retaining wall by 3 feet north, you'll preserve the slope and redirect runoff without disrupting tree coverage." The room went silent. Jonathan looked at her. "Is that based on Daniel's elevation reports?" "Yes," she said. "And the county's floodplain data?" The landscape architect raised his eyebrows. "How do you know that I read the packet?" she replied. "It was in the attachments. They made the adjustment." Jonathan didn't say thank you. He simply handed her his coffee mug the next morning and said, "Black. No sugar." She smiled, and he caught it this time. The truth was, Jonathan hadn't expected to like her. He didn't dislike people. He just didn't need them. Not in the way others seemed to. Since Elise and Anna died, his world had narrowed to blueprints and contracts. The structure made sense. Emotions did not. He didn't have time for charming personalities or office friendships. They required more than he could give. But Emily Rhodes was different. She didn't ask for his attention. She didn't fill silences with small talk. She just showed up, did the work, and carried herself like someone who had already fought the hardest battle of her life. And maybe that's what intrigued him. Maybe that's what scared him. Then came the rooftop lunch. It wasn't planned. The weather had warmed just enough for the building's terrace to be tolerable. Emily stepped out with her sandwich and tea, hoping for 5 minutes of sun. To her surprise, Jonathan was already there leaning against the rail, coat collar turned up, staring at the lake. She paused, unsure. "You're fine," he said, without turning. "It's not mine." She sat quietly on the far bench. They didn't speak. The wind filled the space between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. After a while, Jonathan broke the silence. "You always this composed," Emily shrugged. "Depends on the day. And the decade." She smiled faintly. "Also depends." He glanced at her. "Where did you learn to handle stress the way you do?" She didn't answer right away. Just took a slow sip of tea. Then, gently, she said, "From loss." Jonathan said nothing more, but he didn't leave. Neither did she. Back at her apartment that evening, Emily reflected on the rooftop moment. Not the words, exactly, but the quiet that came after. The way Jonathan had listened not to facts, not to numbers, but to space. Silence. Sometimes. That was harder than any reply. She wondered what it meant that they could share something wordless, yet whole. The next morning, Jonathan arrived earlier than usual. On his desk was the updated proposal for the Vermont Community Center, a project he'd shelved for nearly a year. He hadn't told anyone to bring it out. Yet there it was. He stared at the plans, then at the sticky note affixed to the corner. Some bridges are worth rebuilding. It wasn't signed, but he knew the handwriting. That afternoon, during another high-stakes meeting with a visiting investor, Jonathan again delivered his proposal with his usual crispness. Numbers, metrics, timelines. Emily sat nearby, interpreting where needed. When he used a phrase about non-negotiable milestones, she softened it slightly in translation, adding nuance about local permitting concerns. The investor nodded, satisfied. When the meeting ended, Jonathan didn't leave. He turned to her. The room now empty. "I said it wrong." Emily looked at him, thoughtful. "No, you said it right," she replied, "just not soft." He raised an eyebrow. "You think softness matters?" She answered without hesitation. "In some rooms, it's the only thing that gets heard." Jonathan was quiet for a long time. Then, for the first time in weeks, he smiled, not a smirk, not polite amusement, a real, quiet smile, small but true. Emily caught her breath, not because of the smile itself, but because, for a flicker of a second, it made him look young, less burdened, like someone who had once laughed easily, and for reasons she couldn't name, that startled her more than anything else he'd done. It had started as an ordinary Thursday evening. The wind outside had picked up, brushing heavy snow against the windows of Hale and Whitmore's headquarters. Most of the staff had already left for the day, eager to get home before the storm worsened, but Emily remained, finishing up revisions to a zoning permit report that had been flagged earlier. Jonathan was still in his office too, pacing quietly as he reread a letter from an old client. They were, as usual, the last two in the building. At 6:43 p.m., the lights flickered once then went out. The silence that followed was so complete it was almost intimate. No humming from the vents, no clack of computer keys, no distant laughter from the break room, just stillness. Then came the emergency lights, dim, red-tinted, casting everything in soft shadows. The building's backup generator had kicked in, but only for essentials. Elevators, apparently, were not considered essential. Emily had just stepped into the elevator on the 4th floor. The doors closed, the panel lit for the lobby, and then stopped. Moments later, the elevator shuddered and froze. She waited a beat, then pressed the door open button. Nothing. She pressed alarm, a faint ding, but no movement. Before panic could take hold, the elevator chimed again, and then, unexpectedly, the doors opened, only partially, just enough for a figure to squeeze in. Jonathan Hale. He stepped inside, eyes narrowing in the emergency light. "You're stuck too." Emily managed a half smile. Apparently. The doors groaned shut behind him, then locked. They were now two people in a box suspended between floors, with a storm swirling outside and no way to tell how long they'd be there. Jonathan leaned back against the mirrored wall, his expression unreadable. "No signal," he said after checking his phone. Emily held hers up. 1 bar, then nothing. Minutes passed, then more. No one spoke. The silence was not awkward, not with them. It had texture, weight, a kind of mutual understanding that didn't need filling. But time has a way of softening resistance. After a while, the walls around both of them felt less like boundaries and more like witnesses. Jonathan finally broke the quiet. "You always stay late," Emily nodded. "Sometimes the quiet helps me think." He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "You don't talk much about yourself." "Neither do you," she replied. Another beat of silence. Jonathan glanced upward, as if the ceiling might offer an escape route. When it didn't, he sighed. "Elise, my wife, used to hate storms," he said. It was the first time he had ever said her name aloud in front of anyone in the office. Emily didn't move, didn't speak, just listened. 7 years ago, he continued, she insisted on going on site to the Colorado project. I told her it was too risky. Early spring thaw, unstable terrain. She went anyway. Said it was her responsibility to see the land herself. He paused. There was a snowslide. They never found her body. The elevator seemed to breathe around them. I kept thinking, he said, his voice low. If I'd been more firm, if I'd gone with her, if I'd stopped her. He swallowed. For a long time, I thought I'd killed the person I love most, and I've lived every day since trying to earn the right to still be here. Emily's hands rested softly on her lap. She nodded once. I had a daughter. Her name was Lily. Jonathan's gaze sharpened, not in surprise, in understanding. We were driving back from a recital, just a normal day. Rain came fast. A truck behind us didn't stop. I was conscious. I heard her. Then I didn't. She closed her eyes. For a long time, I wished it had been me instead. They sat in that silence. It wasn't heavy. It was sacred, not grief sharing space, grief recognizing itself. Jonathan looked at her then, not as a CEO, not as a man who built walls, just as a human. Maybe we both became experts at surviving, he said, but forgot how to live. Emily smiled, gently. That sounds about right. The elevator jerked lightly. A low buzz hummed above them, then light soft at first, then stronger. The backup systems were rebooting. The control panel blinked, buttons lit up again. The doors, groaning in protest, began to slide open. Jonathan stepped forward, but instead of exiting first, he turned back and held the door. Emily stepped out slowly, pausing to meet his eyes. Maybe, she said softly, you're not the only one living like that. And then she walked away. He didn't follow, just stood there, holding the door long after it no longer needed to be held. Not because she needed him to, but because, for once, he didn't want to let the moment close. It started as just another task. Emily had offered to assist the records team with digitizing old architectural plans. Hale and Whitmore's archives went back nearly 3 decades, housed in a windowless room that smelled of aged paper and dried ink. She liked the quiet in there. It was a kind of silence that didn't demand anything from her. The plans were rolled tightly, some yellowed with time, others marked with tiny, precise notes in pencil. Jonathan's handwriting, she recognized, from the way the lowercase g looped. Her job was simple scan, label, upload, but simplicity had a way of hiding what mattered most. It was just after noon when she unrolled the blueprint labeled Crestline Site, Elevation South, Final Approval. The date was familiar 3 weeks before the Colorado survey, the one Elise Hale never came back from. She stared at it longer than necessary. The contour lines, the ridges, the slope grading all so detailed, but something pulled at her attention, like an itch she couldn't reach. Later that day, another version surfaced. This one labeled the same, but dated just 5 days before the accident. It was identical almost. Almost. A small retaining wall that existed in the first plan was gone in the second. The cliff edge Elise had hiked to, according to records, was supposed to have been stabilized. In this new version, that section looked raw, exposed, riskier. Emily went still. She checked the metadata. The second version had been uploaded by someone with higher clearance than hers, far above hers. In fact, a name she didn't recognize at first. Then she did. Douglas Krell, senior board member, longtime investor, one of the remaining founders, and the man Jonathan never spoke of. Ever. She stared at the screen. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly. Somewhere outside, snow was melting on the pavement, water trickling into the storm drains like the passage of time. She printed both versions, side by side, ran her fingers over the lines. It was easy to miss, easy to think it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Someone had redrawn the plans, and someone had sent Elise Hale to walk that path. Emily sat in her car during lunch, holding the folder. She didn't eat, didn't move. The engine stayed off. A cold wind rolled fog over the windshield. Her mind warred silently. It's not your place. It's not your business. You'll lose your job. Maybe worse. But another thought, softer, kept rising beneath the noise. Maybe he didn't deserve the guilt. That night, she left the folder on Jonathan's desk, neat, unlabeled, except for a yellow sticky note, small and handwritten. Maybe it wasn't your fault. No signature. She didn't sleep that night, but she didn't regret it. Jonathan found the folder when the building was empty. The janitorial staff had just finished vacuuming the main lobby. Wind outside was tossing branches against the old windows. He sat down, opened it. At first, nothing made sense. Then everything did. His hand hovered over the two plans. One old, one altered, one safe, one deadly. He read the upload logs 3 times. The name was there, clear as ink. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't sharp. It was dull, like a weight finally recognized after being carried too long. He thought he might cry, but no tears came. Only the trembling, his fingers, strong enough to draft cathedrals from glass and steel, now shook with something too old to name. He turned off the light and sat alone in the dark. The auditorium of Hale and Whitmore was filled with the kind of silence that only candles could command. Rows of them lined the stage, flickering gently in glass cylinders, casting warm shadows on the polished wood floor. It was the 7-year anniversary of Elise Hale's passing an annual memorial held privately within the company. But this time, it was different. This time, Jonathan was going to speak. Emily had been the one to help prepare his remarks. She had typed up the speech exactly as he dictated, sharp, restrained, measured, the kind of speech a CEO gives when he wants to remember a woman he once loved without letting anyone see he still grieves. She understood that instinct. She had done it herself, in other forms. Jonathan had spent the past 3 days avoiding the office, working from home, reviewing the speech late into the night. But that morning, he arrived early, earlier than usual. The printed copy was folded twice and tucked into his inside jacket pocket. At 6:30 p.m., the lights dimmed. The sound of strings. Vivaldi, she thought, echoed softly through the room. The employees sat in silence, coats draped on their laps, hands folded, a few tissues already drawn discreetly from handbags and jacket sleeves. Most of them had never met Elise, but they knew the stories, the brilliance, the ambition, the laughter that had once filled these walls. Emily stood behind the curtain, stage left, just out of view. She was meant to cue the slideshow after the speech, a simple task, but her eyes kept returning to the man waiting behind the podium. Jonathan Hale, in a dark navy suit, not black, a small white rose pinned to his lapel. When his name was introduced, he didn't move for a second too long. Then he walked, calm and steady, to the podium. The paper remained in his hand, perfectly creased. He unfolded it slowly, raised his gaze to the audience, opened his mouth, and nothing came out. The silence stretched, 1 second, 3, 5. Then he drew a breath, shaky, audible. "I wrote something," he said, his voice low and flat. "I spent the week writing it." He looked down at the paper, then folded it again. "But I think she'd rather I speak as her husband, not as the man the board expects." No one moved. I met Elise during our first internship in Boston. She was loud, brilliant, always finishing my sentences and rewriting my blueprints. Soft laughter rippled through the room, quickly fading. She died 7 years ago today. In a field report trip to Colorado, the official record called it a rock slide, a structural instability on a slope she believed was safe. His voice thickened. "For 7 years. I believed I caused that. I signed off on a design that was later deemed flawed. I sent her there. I encouraged it. I convinced her it was safe." Emily's breath caught. She knew what was coming, but it still hit like ice water. But a few days ago, someone showed me something, a different version of the blueprint, a version I never approved, one that removed a retaining wall, one that was uploaded by a man I trusted. He paused. I'm not saying this to accuse. I'm saying it because I've been grieving the wrong way, carrying a burden that might not even be mine. And I think Elise, if she were here, she'd tell me to let it go, to stop building my life like one of my buildings airtight, no doors, no windows, just steel, silence again. And maybe he looked up at the ceiling as if looking for her. Maybe she sent someone to remind me. From behind the curtain. Emily blinked, startled. Her fingers tightened around the cue remote, but her eyes never left the stage. Jonathan's hand trembled slightly as he rested it on the edge of the podium. There are some truths that don't come easy, but when they do, they shatter the walls. We thought we needed to survive. His voice dropped, almost a whisper. I don't want to survive anymore. I want to live again. For her, and maybe for more than that. He gave a small nod, not to the audience, but to himself, and then he stepped away. No applause, just stillness. He walked down the steps slowly, deliberately, past the front row, avoided every outstretched hand, every sympathetic glance, until he reached stage left, where Emily stood, stunned. He didn't speak, didn't stop walking, but as he passed her, he turned just slightly and held her gaze. His eyes said everything, and then he was gone. Emily remained where she stood for a long moment. The cue button in her hand was never pressed. The slideshow never played. The speech she'd typed lay untouched on a nearby table. Perfect, polished, never used. She walked down the side aisle, settling into the first empty chair she found. Around her, people were murmuring. Whispers filled the space. But in her ears, there was only the sound of what had just been broken and what had begun to heal. She looked down at the folded pages in her hand, the ones Jonathan had never read, and for some reason, she didn't feel disappointment. She felt relief. Because sometimes, the best speeches are the ones never spoken. It had been 3 days since the memorial. The building felt quieter, though no one said anything. People returned to work, but the air inside Hale and Whitmore was different now, as though something sacred had been spoken aloud, and no one knew quite how to respond. Emily went back to her tasks. No one had officially assigned her to keep working in the archives, but Jonathan hadn't asked her to stop either. So, she did what she had always done best. She stayed invisible. Quiet, intentional. She spent the mornings in the corner of the records room, headphones in her ears playing soft cello music, gloved hands unrolling brittle plans from cardboard tubes. She cataloged, she scanned, she made notes in pencil, never pen, and she paid attention to what most people ignored. That was how she found it. A blueprint labeled Crestline Project, Safety Overlay, V3.2. She had seen V3.1 the week before. That one included a full avalanche warning system across the eastern ridge. But this one, the newer one, did not. Her eyes scanned the notes. Someone had removed the alert system entirely. The ridgeline was still flagged as unstable, but no mitigation measures were included. Her stomach tightened. At the bottom corner of the digital log, the final update was made by D. Kerrigan. Her breath caught. David Kerrigan, another board member, older, a fixture in the company for decades, always polite in meetings, always smiling just a little too much. She leaned back in the creaky office chair, staring at the ceiling tiles. Jonathan had told her Elise stayed behind on the day of the accident to recheck a sensor that kept giving false readings. The alert zone had been activated and then suddenly stopped. Emily opened her laptop, accessed the archive logs. There, buried in a backdated email folder linked to the engineering lead. She found it, an email from David Kerrigan, dated 6 days before the accident. We need to hit the ground deadline. Do what you need to do to move this through. Don't let one woman's caution delay an entire phase. Weather's in our favor for now. There was no direct order, nothing criminal on paper, but the subtext was clear, and the consequences had already been written in stone. Emily printed the email, folded it gently, back at her desk. She placed it inside a plain manila envelope. No label, no address, just sealed truth waiting for air. She didn't mail it, she didn't deliver it, she just kept it in the top drawer of her file cabinet. As a line in the sand, outside the window, snow began to fall quiet, soft, unannounced. Emily stood by the window, watching it cover the courtyard brick by brick, one truth at a time. And in her hand, the envelope stayed warm, not ready to let go, but no longer hidden. The morning after the snowfall was quieter than most. The building stirred slowly, like a sleeping house reluctant to wake. Emily arrived early, the manila envelope still in her bag, slightly creased from being held too long in her hands. She didn't knock when she entered Jonathan's office. He looked up, surprised, but didn't speak. His eyes were shadowed, more tired than usual, as though the past few nights had aged him in ways daylight hadn't noticed. She walked to the edge of his desk, took the envelope from her bag, and set it down without a word. Jonathan didn't reach for it. "I've seen enough," he said softly. "What good does it do to open more old wounds?" Emily didn't respond immediately. She sat down across from him, folded her hands in her lap, and let the silence stretch. "Do you know what haunts me?" she said finally. Her voice was low, even, that if I had left work 5 minutes earlier that day, my daughter would still be alive. I tell myself it wouldn't have mattered, that it was a drunk driver, that it was fate. But I still wake up some nights thinking, what if I'd gotten there first? Jonathan's face shifted. The wall he always carried in his expression cracked slightly. "You think this was your fault?" she continued. "Because that's what grief does. It tricks us into carrying weight we were never meant to hold." He looked at the envelope, still untouched. "You don't have to open it now," she said. "But you should know someone made a choice that day. And it wasn't you." She stood, her coat still damp at the hem from the walk-in. "I'll be in the records room if you need anything." But Jonathan didn't move, not for a long while. That evening, the snow had stopped, but the sky remained the same soft gray that made shadows linger longer than they should. Jonathan found her still in the archives, seated on the floor among blueprints and tubes. He didn't speak as he lowered himself to sit beside her. Between them was a large sheet spread out across the carpet, a half-finished concept design for a community center. One Elise had started, one that had never been built. Emily ran her fingers lightly along the sketched roofline. "She was brilliant," she said. Jonathan nodded slowly. "She saw space differently than I did. I saw structure, she saw purpose." For a while, they didn't say anything. The quiet wasn't awkward. It was the kind that comes when two people realize they don't have to explain themselves. "I don't know where to begin again," Jonathan admitted finally. Emily didn't look at him when she answered. From "we," not "I." He turned to her, something unreadable flickering across his face. Then, without a word, he reached out and touched her hand, just lightly, barely more than a graze. But she didn't pull away. The next morning, long before the rest of the building filled with footsteps and calls, Jonathan sat alone in his office with the envelope open in front of him. He dialed a number from memory. When his lawyer answered, he said only one sentence. "We need to talk about David Kerrigan." It was still snowing when the boardroom filled with the rustle of coats, the murmurs of half-finished conversations, and the quiet clink of coffee cups. The windows were lined with frost, and the faint gray light of mid-morning gave the room a reverent glow, as if what was about to happen demanded a hush. Jonathan Hale stood at the head of the long table, his hands resting lightly on the polished wood. He hadn't brought notes. He didn't need them. "Thank you for coming on short notice," he said simply. No one interrupted, not even David Kerrigan. The tension in the room was different today. Less about quarterly earnings, more about the chill in Jonathan's voice, the calm that carried weight. "7 years ago," he began, "my wife, Elise, died in a construction incident tied to the Whitmore Ridge project. At the time, the cause was listed as a failure in avalanche detection response, a tragedy, but not unusual in high-risk terrain. He let that hang in the air for a breath. Last week, a series of older files were brought to my attention, discrepancies between initial and final plans, and evidence that someone with executive-level access made changes that removed key safety elements. At the far end of the table, David shifted in his seat. His expression remained neutral, but his knuckles whitened as his fingers curled around his pen. Jonathan didn't look at him. He turned to the screen behind him, where two versions of the blueprint appeared, one clearly older, with a timestamp dated 3 weeks before the accident, the other finalized days before Elise's departure to Colorado. The earlier version included a redundantly coded avalanche alert system, Jonathan continued. The later one did not. Silence. Only the sound of the heater clicking on. "It was signed off," David finally said, his voice even, "by our former senior engineer, and you. I authorized the structure, yes," Jonathan said, "but not the edits, and not the removal of safety protocols." Another pause. Then a quiet knock at the door. Emily stepped in. She held a thin binder in her hands and walked with steady steps to Jonathan's side. Her voice, when she spoke, was gentle but clear. "These are internal emails between Mr. Kerrigan and the project lead. They reference the need to avoid additional delays and suggest that snow protocols can be streamlined." She laid the binder on the table. Also included are metadata extracts from our archives showing access and edit logs. The last edit was made from Mr. Kerrigan's credentials. It was never re-reviewed. The silence became denser, heavier. Jonathan nodded once, then opened a leather notebook he hadn't touched until now. He didn't read numbers or minutes. Instead, he read words that weren't his own. "April 18th, he read. "John would never leave a flaw like this. Not on purpose. I know him too well, but I worry someone else might not be looking as closely." He closed the notebook. Elise wrote that the night before she left. David didn't speak. No one did. When the motion was brought to the table, whether to suspend David Kerrigan from the board pending full review, there were no objections, only a single abstention. When the vote passed, David stood, pale and stiff, and walked out without a word. The sound of the door closing was quieter than expected. The room began to stir again, voices re-emerging in cautious tones, papers shuffled back into order. But Jonathan didn't move. He stood at the edge of the room, staring out through the frosted glass where snow continued to fall like the slow exhale of winter. Emily approached but didn't speak. She stood beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his shoulder through the fabric of his suit jacket. Neither said a word for several minutes. Then, so softly it was nearly lost in the hush of the snow outside, Jonathan said, "This is the first time in 7 years the snow doesn't feel cold." And Emily, without moving, simply stayed. They had closed a chapter, but neither of them knew how to begin the next one. The snow had stopped 2 days ago, but a blanket of white still coated the streets, softening every sound in the small Vermont town. At Hale and Whitmore, the halls were quieter now, not because the staff spoke less, but because a kind of reverence lingered like the stillness that follows a storm. Something had shifted, not loudly, but undeniably. Jonathan Hale returned to his routines, meetings, emails, morning walks around the lake behind the building. Yet the air felt different when he stepped into his office. Less like a fortress, more like a room that had been opened to light for the first time in years. And still, it wasn't peace he felt. It was waiting. Emily, too, went about her days in near silence, filing documents, answering calls, organizing site visits. But she moved with a quiet deliberateness, as if each action was a thread she was tying off, a subtle preparation for departure. On her desk sat a folder, unopened, but marked with the logo of a larger firm based out of Chicago. The letter inside offered her a managerial position, a significant raise, a relocation package, and a team of her own. It had arrived 3 days ago. She hadn't spoken of it to anyone, except for Jonathan, And even then, she hadn't said a word. He had seen it. She knew he had. It had been in her hand the morning she passed by him in the hallway. Their eyes met for just long enough. He didn't ask. She didn't offer. And now, the air between them was filled with unsaid things. Each day passed like that, moments that brushed up against meaning, but never fully stepped into it. A glance too long, a silence too short. A kindness offered, then retracted slightly, as if fearing its own weight. It was Thursday evening when Emily walked home. The sidewalks were still slick from the melt, her boots leaving small impressions as she moved. Her mind wandered Chicago, the lakefront, new streets, a new title, but it all felt distant, like imagining someone else's future. A slow engine hum interrupted her thoughts. She looked over her shoulder. Jonathan's car pulled up beside the curb. He didn't lean out, just looked at her through the rolled-down window. She hesitated only a second before opening the door and slipping into the passenger seat. They didn't speak. He drove slowly, carefully, the radio off. The heater filled the silence with its low hum. The streets passed like thoughts quiet, bundled in snow. She watched the outline of his hands on the steering wheel, the way his jaw tightened slightly when they turned onto Elm Street. He glanced at her once, briefly, then looked away. The quiet wasn't heavy, but it wasn't easy, either. When they reached the street where her apartment sat, he eased the car to the curb and left it idling. Still, neither moved. Then, at last, his voice low, steady, but with something fragile clinging to the edges. "You're going to leave, aren't you?" Emily looked down at her gloved hands, then out at the snowy sidewalk, the porch light of her building flickering slightly in the distance. She offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You're not going to stop me, are you?" He didn't answer right away, just exhaled, a soft white cloud of breath in the cold air. Then, finally, the truth. "I've never wanted someone to stay more than I want you to." The words didn't echo, they didn't need to. They sat there for another long moment, not touching, not deciding, just feeling the quiet truth between them, that sometimes the hardest part of healing isn't the breaking or the pain, it's choosing what comes next. Emily reached for the door handle, then paused. "Good night, Jonathan." He looked at her. The faintest nod, a quiet understanding. "Good night, Emily." And just like that, she stepped out into the night. The door closed gently behind her, and Jonathan watched as her figure receded up the walkway, until the porch light swallowed her shape. But this time, he didn't drive away. He sat there, engine humming, a thought taking form, not quite a decision, but maybe the beginning of one. She had 2 job offers, but her heart was waiting for a question that hadn't been asked yet. Emily sat by the window in her apartment, the early March sun spilling across the table, catching the edge of a photograph she hadn't packed yet. It was of Lily, her daughter, in a faded pink scarf, smiling mid-laugh with snow in her lashes. She traced the frame lightly with her fingers, the kind of touch reserved for memories too fragile to hold in full. There were 2 letters on the table beside the photo. One was an official offer from a design firm in Portland, a position with more money, better hours, and a clean start. The other was a handwritten note unfinished, addressed to Jonathan Hale. It simply read, "Thank you for seeing me." She hadn't finished the rest. Downstairs, the Hale and Whitmore building buzzed like any other Thursday morning. Projects were moving again. The community center design was nearing completion. The hush that had fallen after the board meeting had given way to cautious momentum, like the ground softening after a long frost. Emily walked into the office a little later than usual. No one commented. It was the kind of morning where people felt the change in season more than they noticed the clock. She spent most of the morning sorting through her things. The drawer she had barely filled now seemed strangely full paper clips, extra pens, a pack of mints Lily once slipped into her purse. When she picked up the photo frame, she wrapped it gently in one of Jonathan's old architectural drafts, the kind on thick vellum that smelled faintly of graphite. There was a knock on her open door. "We're having a quick team meeting in the South Conference Room," Anne from HR said with a polite smile. Jonathan wants everyone there. Something about the community center leadership. Emily nodded, placing the wrapped photo into her tote bag. In the conference room, the air felt expectant. Emily stood toward the back, near the coffee station, arms folded lightly across her chest. Jonathan was already at the front, looking more at ease than she'd seen him in weeks. He spoke of progress, of how the firm was entering a new season, not just in terms of design, but of connection. He thanked the team for weathering challenges, for staying through transitions and uncertainty. Then he cleared his throat. We've reviewed proposals for who will lead the Hale Community Center project, he said. It's a position that requires not only vision, but empathy, and an ability to listen to what's between the lines. He paused, looking straight at her. And that's why I've asked Emily Rhodes to lead the next phase. There was a beat of silence, followed by polite applause, then genuine applause. Emily blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't accepted anything, hadn't even said yes. And yet, something in her chest stirred not from the recognition, but from the way Jonathan hadn't asked in private. He had offered her belonging, publicly, before knowing her answer. After the meeting, she found herself standing in front of his office door, still slightly ajar. She hesitated, then stepped inside. Jonathan stood by the shelves, straightening a few books that were already aligned. When he turned, he gave her a small, almost amused smile. I'm sorry, he said. I should have spoken to you first. I just didn't want to ask you in a way that felt like an obligation. Emily held his gaze. You didn't? He nodded, but there was a hesitance in his posture, as if waiting for her to pull away. I know you've had other offers, he continued. I know I can't offer what they do, not in salary or maybe even clarity. He stepped closer, just enough that his words felt private. But I also know I've never wanted someone to stay more than I want you to. The room felt still, but not heavy. Emily took a breath, her voice quiet. I haven't accepted anything yet. I was waiting for what he asked, for someone to ask if I wanted to stay. He didn't smile, he didn't speak. He just looked at her, eyes soft and open in a way that spoke louder than any reply. And in that silence, something shifted. She felt her shoulders relax, not because everything was resolved, or because grief had finally loosened its grip, but because she wasn't the only one carrying it anymore. She reached into her bag and placed the letter she had written, unfinished, onto his desk. You can read it later, she said. Then she turned and walked out, not as someone leaving, but as someone who might be choosing to remain. Grief never disappears. But sometimes, it builds something beautiful. The spring air in Vermont carried the scent of lilacs and damp earth. It had rained the night before, leaving the paths around the newly opened Whitmore Community Center soft underfoot, the kind of softness that invited slow steps and quiet moments. 1 year had passed since the boardroom confrontation. 1 year since the past had been dragged into the light. And in that time, something new had risen, not just from blueprints or meetings, but from memories, wounds, and the will to begin again. The community center stood at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by sugar maples just beginning to leaf out. It wasn't grand, that had been deliberate. Jonathan and Emily had both agreed this place should feel like a second home, not a monument. The building blended into its surroundings with low lines, warm stone, and large windows that let the sunlight pour in like welcome. There was no official ribbon-cutting ceremony, no speeches, no press, just an open door, warm coffee, and neighbors curious enough to step inside. Near the entrance, on a modest brick wall, a small bronze plaque had been mounted. It didn't list donors or architects. It simply read, "For Anna and Lily, and all the people we still carry inside us." Jonathan had insisted on the wording. Emily had chosen the font. They had both stood in silence the morning it was installed. Now, as the center buzzed with the low hum of new beginnings, children laughing in the garden, seniors chatting in the lounge, volunteers unpacking art supplies. Emily sat in a quiet room near the back, the sunlight casting patterns across the wooden floor. She held a pen, Before her lay a letter written in careful, flowing script. The paper was slightly creased, as if it had been folded and unfolded more than once. "Dear Lily," it began, "I don't know if letters reach heaven. Maybe they just live in the corners of our hearts, whispering back to us when we need them. But I wanted to tell you something. I've stopped pretending I'm okay. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being afraid of the silence." Her pen paused. She looked out the window. The garden had bloomed early this year. Bright tulips stretched toward the sky. Somewhere beyond them, she heard a child's laughter, unfamiliar, but warm. Life. It moved, even when hearts didn't feel ready. "I met someone, Lily. He doesn't try to fix me. He just stays. Even when I fall quiet, even when I push the world away. I think you'd like him. I think you'd laugh at how quiet we both are when we're together." She smiled softly. Her fingers brushed the corner of the page. "This place, we built it for others. But it's healing us too. One drawing at a time, one moment at a time. I walk through these halls, and I don't feel like a shadow anymore." The room around her smelled of cedar and fresh paint. It was new, but it already felt lived in. Emily folded the letter gently and placed it in a small box inside her bag, next to a photograph of Lily. Forever 6. Forever smiling. She stood. As she stepped into the hallway, her eyes caught movement at the far end. Jonathan, walking slowly, his posture more relaxed than it had been in years. He wore no tie today, only a soft gray sweater and a weathered leather satchel. When he saw her, he didn't smile broadly, but something softened in his eyes. That was enough. They walked toward each other without needing to speak. At the center of the garden stood a small wooden arbor, wrapped with climbing vines just beginning to bud. It had been Emily's idea to add it a quiet place, tucked between paths, where people could sit or remember or simply breathe. Jonathan reached her, his steps sure but unhurried. He didn't offer words, just his hand. Emily took it. Together, they stepped beneath the arbor, into a garden that had once only lived on paper. The path ahead was gravel and soft spring moss, dotted with wild violets. It led nowhere in particular, only deeper into the garden's embrace. They walked, two people who had once carried unbearable silences, now sharing one. Above them, the trees whispered with new leaves, and somewhere, inside both their hearts, something quietly said, "You are not alone anymore." Sometimes, all it takes is a moment to change everything. Grief doesn't follow a timeline. It doesn't vanish when we move on. It softens, it reshapes us, and sometimes it quietly guides us toward the people and places that help us heal. This story isn't just about a CEO and a secretary. It's about how two people, both carrying silent sorrows, found meaning again not through grand gestures, but through patience, kindness, and the courage to stay. In life, we often think healing requires answers, but sometimes all it takes is someone willing to listen without fixing, to sit with us in the quiet, and to say, "You don't have to carry this alone." The greatest transformations don't always come with fanfare. They happen in broken elevators, in unspoken glances, in letters never sent. So, if you've lost something or someone, know this: you are not broken. You are becoming. And in the most unexpected moment, healing may find its way to you, through the wrong door or the right heart. Hold space for the small moments, because sometimes they're the ones that save us. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who might need it, and subscribing to our channel for more stories of healing, hope, and humanity. Your support helps us continue telling meaningful stories that matter. See you in the next one.